Yeah! Come on, let's go!
Starting in the 1830s, slavery became a highly controversial topic that caused debates in Congress for over 3 decades. It took time, but eventually the morality of slavery was mainly disputed over by the presidential candidates of 1860. The country was torn apart over the issue of slavery. It was North versus the South, two parts of the U.S. that had completely different views on how to approach and deal with slavery. The North wanted to stop the spread of slavery, while the South favored the expansion of slavery. People rose and fell from power. It was a battle inside our own country, on our own soil. And despite the war being fought between our own kind, blood was still shed. Over 620,000 of our own men, nay, our own citizens, perished at the hands of slavery. As a result, chaos erupted, and the Union was left in shambles. This devastating war completely altered the course of the U.S. and changed the lives of millions of slaves. The Civil War first began with the Battle of Bull Run. The Battle of Bull Run, also known as the Battle of Manassas Junction. This was a very short battle, but it signified the first major battle between the Confederate and the Union. Abraham Lincoln was the first to call an attack in this battle, and his plan was to knock the Confederate off their feet near Manassas, Virginia.
Lincoln wanted simply to preserve the Union. There's a famous comment that he made. He said, if I could preserve the Union by freeing all the slaves, I'd do it. If I could preserve the Union by freeing none of the slaves, I'd do it. If I could preserve the Union by freeing some and keeping the others, I'd do it. He wanted to preserve the Union. Personally, Lincoln was against slavery. But that had nothing to do with what. But when he was elected, the South felt that he was a threat, and that's why the secession took. They said as much, that if Lincoln gets elected, we're leaving. So Lincoln wanted to preserve the Union. It's that simple.
The general of the Union forces, Irvin McDowell, had opposed Lincoln in his decision to attack. McDowell believed that his troops did not have enough experience in combat to proceed with the raid on the Confederates. Even though Lincoln acknowledged this fact, he was more afraid of the press discrediting his name because they were expecting Lincoln to deliver one blow to defeat the Confederate forces. However, this was clearly not what was going to happen. It was evident during the battle that Union forces were clearly dominating the Confederates, as McDowell was more than capable of holding off P.G.T. Beauregard and Stonewall Jackson's forces. However, near sundown, the reinforcement of Confederates under Johnston smothered Union forces with the imminent threat of death. Johnston, Stonewall Jackson, and P.G.T. Beauregard were able to weaken Sherman and McDowell's forces to an extent that they were forced to retreat back to the capital.
William Tecumseh Sherman was born on February 8, 1820 in Lancaster, Ohio. His father passed away when he was 9, and Sherman was sent to live with a family friend, Thomas Ewing Sr. Sherman was sent to West Point Military Academy at the age of 16. Upon entering the military after graduation, Sherman was granted the rank of second lieutenant. In 1850, when Sherman was 30, he married Eleanor Boyle Ewing, the daughter of Thomas Ewing. In 1859, Sherman accepted the post of the first superintendent at the Louisiana State Seminary of Learning and Military Academy. In 1861, when Southern states began to secede from the Union, Sherman resigned his post at LSU and moved back to Ohio. Sherman eventually became one of the Union's best generals during the Civil War, as he was one of the main generals to lead the Union to winning the war.
From the beginning of the battle, Sherman was nervous about the experience his men possessed. The Union Army was inexperienced and untrained in battle, while the Confederates amassed over 30,000 soldiers to fight against them. On the other side of the war, the Confederates were led by Thomas Stonewall Jackson.
Stonewall Jackson, born in 1824, died in 1863. He was one of the more well-known Confederate generals next to Robert E. Lee. He was also a war hero. However, before his successes in the Civil War, Jackson struggled to comprehend ordinary military tactics at West Point. He went on to accomplish a great partnership with Robert E. Lee, as the two played major roles in the Confederate success in the Civil War. Thomas Jackson earned the nickname Stonewall after the Battle of Bull Run. Jackson had led charge that was supposed to close a space in the line of Union forces. Jackson had held his ground for quite some time, he was unwilling to move and fought until the very end. One of the Confederate generals commented that Jackson resembled that of a stone wall, as he would not give up on invading Union forces. Jackson demonstrated a significant amount of bravery in this battle and was deemed to be a major general the following October.
After the Battle of Bull Run ended, resources started to become an issue for the South. They were clearly outmatched by the industry and advancement that the North had. The South lacked a navy, which put them at a disadvantage when the North and South's navies were battling each other. In February of 1862, Lincoln decided to start another war, but on the waterfront. Lincoln planned on stopping the South's trade with the other countries in Europe and also to seize the amount of cotton that the Confederates sold to limit the amount of money they could receive.
The South, you know what the primary crop in the South was. It was cotton.
Right.
They called cotton is king. South was really the only game in town at that point in the early 1860s. South thought that with the cotton, that eventually Britain and France and some other countries would come to their aid and recognize them because they needed Southern cotton for their mills. And actually what the South did, they made a mistake early in the war. They actually started restricting the export of cotton, figured it would make the Europeans more desperate and they would come into the war and support the South earlier. It didn't work, because what happened eventually is the British Empire had a place known as India. And guess what? They found out they can get cotton from India. And all of a sudden, the South's bargaining chip, wasn't quite there anymore.
William Tecumseh Sherman mobilized his division north of Grant's position in Savannah, Tennessee, waiting for Ewell and his men to arrive for support. Sherman and his men set up camp and began preparing food while they were resting. A few Confederate forces started firing on Sherman's camp, which he did not see coming since his men were tending to their camp duties. Eventually, Confederate forces were able to push back Sherman's division along nearly the majority of Union forces. However, once Ewell and his men arrived, Union forces were reinforced by thousands of soldiers. With Buell's army and his own men, Grant was able to launch a counterattack, which caused the Confederates to slowly fall back.
Ulysses S. Grant, also known as Sam to his colleagues at West Point, was born in Point Pleasant, Ohio, on April 27, 1822. In his childhood, Grant developed an unusual ability to work with and control horses. When Grant was 17, Congressman Thomas L. Hammond nominated him to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point in New York. He achieved exceptional grades in mathematics and geology. Although a quartermaster, Grant led a cavalry charge at the Battle of Resaca de la Palma. At Monterrey, he demonstrated his horseman ability by volunteering to carry a dispatch through sniper-lined streets while hanging off the side of his horse, keeping the animal between him and the enemy. His drive and bravery earned him several promotions, including becoming a temporary captain while his permanent rank was lieutenant. He moved into San Francisco during the height of the gold rush of California.
The Confederates were pushed all the way back to Shiloh Church, and this signified Grant's first victory. The Battle of Shiloh was considered to be one of the Civil War's bloodiest battles. Out of 62,000 men, 13,000 died on Union lines, and over 10,000 casualties were inflicted towards the Confederates. This was bloodier than any battle that led up to this one. The Battle of Chancellorsville began on May 1st, 1863. The fighting took place in Virginia, and it was Union General Joseph Hooker versus two of the most known generals of the Civil War, Confederates Robert E. Lee and Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson. The first 2 days of fighting consisted of the Union Army's advancement towards the Confederate Army as they attacked. At the start of the fighting, the Union Army outnumbered the Confederacy 115,000 to 60,000. The Union Army's plan, due to their large number of troops, was to split up and attack the Confederate Army from both sides. However, General Lee and Jackson knew just how to counter this even with a small army. On May 2, 1863, Stonewall Jackson led 30,000 of his men to attack Union lines. However, as night approached, Jackson was still determined to attack Union forces, and this ultimately was his downfall. Jackson was eventually shot by one of his own men, and just like that, one of the war's greatest generals died due to a simple mistake.
Major General Jeb Stuart temporarily replaced him as corps commander.
Jackson is reconnoitering out in front of the lines, and he gets shot by what we call friendly fire, some North Carolinians think he's a Union guy, and they shoot him. And he's wounded in the left arm, and they end up amputating the left arm. And when Lee hears about this, he says, about Jackson, he says, Jackson has lost his left arm, but I have lost my right. That's how important Jackson was to the Confederates. By the way, Jackson eventually dies. After the amputation, he's okay for a little while, and he catches pneumonia, and he dies. And it's a tremendous loss to the South because Lee and Jackson worked so well together. They could read each other's mind. Lee would make a suggestion to Jackson, and Jackson knew what to do.
The battle on May 3rd was one of the fiercest and bloodiest of the Civil War. Robert E. Lee launched multiple attacks against the Union, which resulted in heavy losses of resources, people, and money on both sides. On the same day, Sedgwick crossed the Rappahannock River. After defeating the small Confederate group at Marye's Heights in the Second Battle of Fredericksburg, Sedgwick moved west. The Confederates fought well at the Battle of Salem Church, and by May 4th, they surrounded Heatley's men at Banks Ford. Sedgwick left the ford early on May 5th, and Hooker left with his army as well in the night of May 5th into May 6th. The battle came to a conclusion on May 7th, when Stoneman's cavalry reached Union lines that were east of Richmond.
Union General Joseph Hooker was left to defend the attacks of Robert E. Lee, and instead of doing so, he ordered his men to retreat back across the Rappahannock River in order to place he and his men in a better position to defend Washington, D.C. and Maryland.
Robert E. Lee was born on January 19, 1807 in Stratford Hall, Virginia. Robert was the son of a war hero. His father, Henry Lee III, was known by the nickname Light Horse Harry due to his skills with horses. Henry was the governor of Virginia from 1791 to 1794. He also fought for the United States Army. Henry fought under historical generals George Washington and Nathanael Greene during the American Revolution. Not small shoes to fill for Robert. In 1829, Robert graduated from West Point Military Academy without a single demerit. He became a very successful general, whose tactics helped America win the Mexican-American War. By the time the Civil War was about to erupt, Lee pleaded for peace. However, when faced with the hardest decision of his life, he chose the South. President Lincoln asked him to lead Union forces, but he refused. He did not want to secede from his country, but the thought of invading his home state of Virginia was even worse. He was appointed the head of the Confederate Army, but was forced to surrender to Lincoln's second choice, Ulysses S. Grant, in 1865. He died in 1870, at the age of 63.
Hooker's earlier reluctance to launch an attack against Lee proved fatal in this battle, as it allowed for Lee to split his men in half in order to flank Hooker's men from both sides. Despite Hooker's large advantage in the amount of soldiers, he had refused to launch an attack, instead playing the defensive, which led to his downfall at Chancellorsville. The total number of troops employed in the battle was 154,734, with 97,382 troops belonging to the Union and 57,352 troops belonging to the Confederacy. There were 1,694 killed, 9,672 wounded, and 938 missing and captured Union troops, as well as 1,724 killed, 9,233 wounded, and 2,503 missing and captured Confederate troops.
In June 1863, General Lee launched his second invasion of the Union in less than a year following his victory at the Battle of Chancellorsville. He led his 75,000-man army of Northern Virginia across the Potomac River through Maryland and into Pennsylvania, seeking to win a major battle on Northern soil that would potentially dispirit the Union war effort. His 90,000-strong army of the Potomac pursued the Confederates into Maryland. General Joseph Hooker, its commander, was still upset about his defeat at Chancellorsville and seemed reluctant to chase Lee further. Meanwhile, the Confederates divided their forces and investigated various targets, such as the Pennsylvania capital. On June 28th, President Abraham Lincoln replaced Hooker with General George Meade. This was when Lee learned of the presence of the Army of the Potomac in Maryland. He then ordered his army to concentrate in Gettysburg and prepare to meet the Federal Army. At the same time, Meade sent ahead part of his force into Pennsylvania, but intended to make a stand at Pipe Creek in Maryland.
The Battle of Gettysburg, one of the most known battles of the Civil War, took place on July 1st, 1863. The battle lasted for 3 days. However, the rate at which people were killed or wounded was higher than any battle preceding this one. Confederate Robert E. Lee planned to mobilize his troops in the town of Gettysburg once hearing that the Army of the Potomac was planning an attack against the Confederates. When both armies started to go towards each other, Lee gave his new general, Ewell, orders to Union forces. Due to Ewell's fears of losing to the powerful Union forces, he decided to disobey direct orders and not attack Union lines. Eventually, Winfield Hancock and his men arrived in Gettysburg to reinforce the Confederates to give them a better chance at winning the battle.
Winfield Scott Hancock was born on February 14, 1824, in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. He had an identical twin brother, and he was named after Winfield Scott, the American military commander at the time. He went to school at Norristown Academy, and in 1840, Hancock was nominated into the United States Military Academy at West Point. He struggled with the rigorous academics that took place there, as he finished 18th in a 25-person class at the school in 1844. After school, Hancock sparked his military career, spending the next 2 years serving in Indian Territory as a recruiting officer in Ohio and Kentucky. His first combat experience came during the Mexican-American War, where he served as Major General Winfield Scott. He saw himself rise in the ranks of the military because of the natural leadership qualities that he conveyed, making him a great general.
On July 2, 1863, Confederate troops commanded by General Robert E. Lee attempted to surround Union forces by launching an attack from the left and right of the Union stronghold as well as a straight-on attack. As darkness descends, Union General George Gordon Meade orders his men to attack the Confederate soldiers. The Confederate Army is able to retain one of their bases, but they lose the other two. Lee's orders were to launch an assault on the enemy early in the morning, but Longstreet failed to do this and ended up getting his men into position at 4 p.m. They then started to fire on Daniel Sickles' corps for hours, and there was bloodshed on both lines. Due to the Minnesota Regiment, the Federals were able to retain Cemetery Ridge, but failed to protect the Orchard and Devil's Den. Sickles was wounded during the battle, and Ewell's troops proceeded on Union forces at East Cemetery Hill when Longstreet launched his attack at 4 p.m. There were more than 9,000 casualties on each side, and nearly 35,000 casualties during the 2 days.
On July 3rd, Lee desperately planned an assault on Meade Center. A 15,000-man strong column under General George Pickett was ordered to ignite a massive bombardment of the Union positions.
George Edward Pickett was a Civil War general, fought alongside the Confederacy. George E. Pickett was born in Richmond, Virginia, and was appointed to be in the U.S. Military Academy when he was 17, but graduated last in his class. Pickett was sent to be in the Mexican-American War, where he received a promotion for being the first person to climb over the wall in the Battle of Chapultepec. Pickett was later designated to be a colonel in the Confederate Army. In 1862, Pickett was then promoted again to command a small division in Longstreet's corps. After one of the most crushing losses to the Confederates, Lee asked Pickett a question in regards to the amount of men he had, and Pickett responded by saying, "General Lee, I have no division." In his personal life, Pickett married 3 different times, one of the times being a Native American woman who he eventually had a child with. Sadly, he died at the age of 50 in Norfolk, Virginia.
10,000 Federals responded to the Confederate artillery, and for more than an hour, the guns raged in the heaviest cannon fire of the Civil War. At 3 p.m., Pickett led his force into no man's land and found that Lee's attempt to bombard his army had failed. Union artillery grew great holes in their lines as Pickett's forces attempted to cross the mile distance to Cemetery Ridge. Meanwhile, Yankee infantry fueled the main body of what known as Pickett's Charge. Within an hour, more than 7,000 Confederate troops had been killed or wounded. Within minutes of their arrival, the few hundred of Pickett's men that reached the Union line were dead, dying, or captured. After a brutal third day, both armies held their positions until the night of July 4th, when Lee withdrew by leading his army out of the north, never to invade it again.
Although the Civil War lingers on for a few more years, the Battle of Gettysburg sealed the fate of both sides. The Union had defeated the Confederacy in a 3-day battle, which yielded 50,000 casualties for both the Union and Confederate forces. Many consider this battle to be the turning point of the entire war. General Lee had a prime opportunity to tip the scales in his favor, but just couldn't pull it off. Had this battle gone the other way, it is very possible that the Confederates would have prevailed. However, thanks to the courageous acts of the newly appointed General George Meade, the Union took home a much-needed victory.